With the stroke of divine inspiration, Jesus silenced his opponents and granted dual citizenship to his followers. Many have said that. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Now, the context of this passage is Jesus had been speaking against the religious leaders for some time. The parable of the two sons, often known as the prodigal son. The older son is actually a slap against the religious leaders. The tenant parable and the wedding banquet are all cloaked in criticism of the religious leaders. Well, now it's time to strike back. A mutual enemy creates strange bedfellows. The Pharisees were somewhat against the Romans, but they were willing to compromise. The Herodians, they were definitely with the Romans. And then lurking in the background are the Zealots. They were the political revolutionaries. They were nicknamed the Dagger Men. So these two greater groups came together and they devised a question. A damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of question. And Jesus' answer was fascinating. One colleague said, Jesus fought for the radical middle, a both and. Well, that's the passage that many have preached on over the centuries. I'm going to fast forward to the USA right now and talk about dual citizenship and really talk about what's happened this week with the Supreme Court and Maine. And I did so partly because I didn't have as much time as usual to prepare for the sermon. Also because this whole area of church and state is actually the second most studied field that I've studied over the years. Now, seminary-trained clergy are actually professional historians. We are trained to translate and interpret ancient language and cultures. We're trained in the art of epistemology, which is the whole concept of how you come to know what you know, the study of knowledge. And although he disguises it well, your pastor is very intellectual. He went to a good seminary. He was well trained. I would like to look this morning at the whole subject of what is often called the separation of church and state, First Amendment, church and state. And I know it's a sermon, it's not an academic lecture, so I promised Joe I'd keep it under an hour. So in studying history, the number one issue in trying to understand something is context. Context. What was going on then? And what went on in advance helps one or understand that influences what someone or group said and did. What went before influences what they do or say. What comes after, does that influence what they said or did? No. But it helps in understanding what they meant. It helps us to interpret what they said or did. There's a word, I learned it as eisegesis. I looked it up this week in the dictionary. Wikipedia said eisegesis, but it's reading back into history one's own understanding. That's a great danger, and it's a great barrier to understanding history. And it's hard to break through. because we live lives. And in that period, we get influenced. I remember classic debates in high school and since then, where you have at least two knowledgeable people on the subject, but on opposite opinions. I listen to WGAN often, and Wednesday mornings, Matt Gagnon host Eric and Jeremy, opposites politically, but very knowledgeable, and they debate things. It's really refreshing because they don't get nasty with each other, but they have strong opinions, and they debate. Another non-controversial subject that I've studied is homosexuality and sexual orientation. And I was on the Human Sexuality Study Commission of the Diocese of Massachusetts, the eastern third of the state. And we'd have to give a report to the diocesan convention each year. And I think it was 1991, the editor wrote a phrase, "Each generation believes it has achieved the ultimate truth." That was in the first draft. And then she realized, that's really about me, because I want to change what the church has been teaching. That was removed from the next draft. But I've come to call that generational or cultural ignorance and arrogance. They sometimes go hand in hand. Generational ignorance and arrogance. All right, let's get more precise to the topic, often called separation of church and state. It's the second longest topic I've studied, apart from the Bible, each over 50 years. My first memory of a direct teaching was 1972, R.C. Sproul teaching on the previous year's Supreme Court decision on conscientious objectors. And he talked about the historic just war theory in Christianity. And it also reminds me that the term separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. Likewise, the term Trinity is not in the Bible. We talked about that Thursday night at Bible study, and a couple people were surprised it's not in the Bible. I brought the Episcopal prayer book if somebody wants to read the Nicene Creed where that is discussed. We must approach both issues in a similar manner. The word or terms are not used, but is the concept. And I'd like to say it is for one, it's not for the other. I have a definition of tradition. Episcopalians were real into tradition. Tom White's definition is, tradition is the wrong thing said or done the third time. For pastors, it's often a struggle because we want to affirm people. How much do you correct? How much do you correct? Well, we have traditions going back, thoughts going back in our history, certainly the last 100 years, that are blocking our ability, I believe, culturally, to understand the founders' understanding of the Constitution and the founding of our country. And one of the people that has helped me understand that is Professor Robert Cord. He was professor at Northeastern. He wrote the book, Separation of Church and State, Historical Fact and Current Fiction. Read his book a couple times, had one long phone conversation with him. And because I liked his style where he would quote whole paragraphs of opponents, he wouldn't be lifting things out of context. He would show the context. I liked that so much, I read the two opponents that he was really debating a lot. One was an ACLU historian. One was an Episcopalian. And this concept of debate, I got myself invited as the guest speaker to the Connecticut Valley Atheist Association influence. And I'll mention another lecture that I went to in a few minutes. And I'm currently reading The Black-Robed Regiment, which is about a large group of pastors who, starting in about the 1750s, preached for revolution against the king, and that it was God's will. There are a number of people who will say the First Amendment is first because it was in the mind and heart of the framers, first and primary. Now, I'd already read his book, but in that long conversation with Dr. Cord, I could just, it was a phone conversation, but I could see a twinkle in his eye when he was answering this. And he said, well, maybe those people had clairvoyance, because the Congress sent 12 amendments out to the states for ratification. The states didn't ratify the first two. So what we call the First Amendment was actually the third. So the First Amendment was not first for those reasons. But we have that blockage. If you don't know that history, you can say that and be clueless that you're wrong. Now, I'm going to give you some historical examples. I hope to show you what was truly understood back in time. And I'm going to say this will show you, yes, we have a strong Christian foundation. Yes, we can be strong Christians in our country today. But there's a danger about examples. They could be examples of the wrong thing. So illustrations are supposed to illustrate a truth. And I hope that's what I'm doing with you. John Adams, a signatory for the Declaration of Independence, helped frame the Constitution, and he was our second president, said this: "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whole goes through a net." Here's the key statement. Our Constitution is designed only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for any other. Friends, I was hearing about my sermon this morning, even as I'm going out the door. This is how current it is. At 6:45 this morning, I learned that there was another Supreme Court decision in addition to the one about our main voucher system. That's the big one. Of course, obviously, Roe v. Wade. But in terms of separation of church and state, the court ruled that the main voucher system cannot discriminate against religious schools. Well, apparently there was another one. This Arizona person was saying an even bigger ruling. I still have to learn about that. Anybody? And then as I'm going out the door, they're talking to Coach Kennedy, whose case must be decided tomorrow because it hasn't been come forth. One more day of the court. And he's the coach that was fired for praying by himself. And ESPN said, if this guy is allowed to do that, it's going to destroy democracy. Alexis de Tocqueville, who toured America for a couple years and wrote his famous book, Democracy in America, or American Democracy, he said the key to democracy in America is the churches. ESPN is ignorant of history. 100 years ago, Coach Kennedy might have been fired for not praying with his students. But that's what it can do. Ignorance can allow you to feel something very strongly and not have a guilty conscience. Dr. Cord records the House of Representatives, their first, my eyesight is perfectly bad. It's in between using reading glasses and not, so I need to hold the text. One of the earliest acts of the first House of Representatives was to elect a chaplain on Friday, May 1st, 1789. The quote is, "The House proceeds by ballot to the appointment of a chaplain, and the Reverend William Lynn was elected. James Madison was a member of the Constitutional Committee recommending that." I think Lynn was an Episcopalian. Their first financial transaction, flip the page, further in 1789, maybe it wasn't first, the committee's recommendation was that Congress enact legislation paying congressional chaplains an annual salary of $500 out of federal funds. Giving you a little hint? Giving you a little hint there? By 1896, Congress was allocating over $500,000 annually to pay church denominations to educate Indians, Native Americans. He records 40 treaties that the United States had for various Christian denominations to educate and, as they said, Christianize Native Americans. And then the final example from Cord is our old Thomas Jefferson. Now his famous line to the Danbury, Connecticut is this: "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Sorry, that's the first two phrases of the First Amendment. And here it is: "Thus building a wall separation." Thus building a wall of separation between church and state. And it's greatly debated what he meant by that. But you might read 6 years later, he said what he meant by that. Instead of all the theories about that, he wrote this. This was to a Presbyterian clergyman. "I consider the government of the United States as interdicted by the Constitution from intermeddling with religious institutions, their doctrines, discipline, or exercises. This results not only from the provision that no law shall be made respecting an establishment or free exercise of religion, but from that also which reserves to the states powers not delegated to the United States." States' rights was the biggest issue in developing the Constitution and what became known as the Bill of Rights. Suppressing the power of the central government, holding up the power of state government. This is what's in play with these, what we say is the Bill of Rights, and certainly the First Amendment. He goes on to say, "Certainly no power to prescribe any religious exercise or to assume authority in religious discipline has been delegated to the general government, the federal government. It must then rest with the states as far as it can be in any human authority." States' rights. And yet, I read to you what Congress did. Speaking of Congress, the Capitol building, they held church services every Sunday in the Capitol building till the Civil War. Separation of church and state gives you a little understanding of what they meant. Final sets of quotes. Education. Education and social welfare. Where is that in the Constitution? It's not there. So if something isn't there, what do you assume? You continue what was going on. What was going on? All education was done by churches. It was all done by churches. That was part of states' rights. When Jimmy Carter brought forth the federal education department, that was a breach of the Constitution. It's the state's responsibility, and it was the churches that were doing the teaching. This part of history haven't studied a lot, but my understanding is the whole concept of a secular public education didn't happen until Horace Mann, Secretary of Education, first Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, wrestled power from the Congregational Church with public education in the 1830s and 40s. It was the churches that performed the education. Now my final set of quotes. Oh, I'll do one more quote. One more reference anyway. One of the other lectures I attended was 1995. I went up to Storrs, which is where the University of Connecticut was, to hear someone that I would oppose, but I wanted to learn from this person. And about 10 minutes into the lecture, my heart started racing. My pulse was racing, and I was amazed. This guy was saying the national ACLU with its absolute separation doctrine is all wet. It was saying Hugo Black, who wrote the majority opinion, 1947 Everson opinion, he didn't know history, he was ignorant of history, and going on and on. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, he quoted them and said, if you know what they believe, that's the opposite of what the majority held. They didn't carry the day, Madison and Jefferson, whatever they did. The reason I was so amazed that attorney Charles Wilson, who clerked for Warren Burger, who's an expert in constitutional law, was the legal counsel for the Washington Bureau of the ACLU. And we corresponded afterwards. He sent me his annotated notes. There's a guy that knew history, even though he was an ACLU attorney. I won't quote him there. All right, time's running. Still under an hour, though. All right. Last guy, Kinney. Church and state, the struggle for separation in New Hampshire, 1630 to 1900. Now, you get a sense with his title. I don't agree with his premise, but what I like about him is he has a lot of historical quotes. And here's what I'm going to start with. What I want you to listen here is you're going to hear the attitude that the vast majority of reference, historically, of separation church and state comes from the attitude you're going to hear, especially this first quote. This is from the Royal Commissions of two guys in the 1700s. The law concerning liberty and conscience. You shall permit a liberty of conscience to all persons, parentheses, except papists, who are those? Roman Catholics, so they be contented with a quiet and peaceable enjoyment of the same, not giving offense or scandal to government. Okay? Longer quote. Now this guy, Isaac Hill, is actually a pro-Roman Catholic. But listen to what he says. But such, he's talking about the state of Alabama. didn't have a religious test. 9 of 13 original states had established denominations, church denominations, and most of them had religious tests. Federal government wasn't supposed to, but states did. But such, we regret to say, is not the case under the Constitution of New Hampshire. Our Constitution, to our discredit, does contain a religious test. It requires, as a qualification for the office of Chief Magistrate, that he, quote, be of the Protestant religion, end quote. Happily, the people of this state, as yet, have experienced no difficulty from this clause in our Constitution. But does anyone pretend, in this enlightened day, that a pious and conscientious Catholic is less worthy to be a governor than many persons who call themselves Protestant? So this guy is trying to defend Roman Catholics against the majority opinion. And then my final quote from this guy, or from this book, is O.C. Moore, who is the Moore majority opinion. This is a little longer, quote, long paragraph. The highest, okay, this is writing in 1877, and he's referencing a 10-year-old papal encyclical. The highest authority in the sect, assuming to speak with the awful potentiality and infallibility, declared in the encyclical letter of 1864 that Catholic parents had no right to educate their children in other than Catholic schools. In the most populous city of this state, that was Manchester, for a dozen years, or even since the issue of that letter, the children of Catholic parents have not been permitted to attend the public schools, but have attended sectarian schools exclusively. So long as any sect regards the public schools with hostility, the public school system is menaced with a danger that only a constitutional provision can avert. The free public school is the true nursery of freedom and equality. With all its faults, and it has many, it is still the one influence that out of many nations molds one nationality. Last sentence. That out of many faiths form one faith in God and humanity. That out of weakness and ignorance and poverty emerges the strong, reliant, affluent, and magnificent American citizens. So this guy, again, you see the attitude toward Roman Catholics. Now the author the author concludes with this. Lest this seem to prove more the author of this address viciously anti-Catholic, it should be stated that in the same speech he demanded that the religious test, which was keeping Catholics from holding of public office, should be removed from the Constitution. Separation of church and state, the vast majority of references, with two exceptions, at least a couple exceptions, was Protestants fingering Roman Catholics, saying you cannot run for public office. Why? Because we Protestants have freedom of thought, of conscience. You must submit to that guy over there, to the Pope. Now that was their attitude, whether you agree with it or not, whether it's right or wrong, that was the principal attitude. Two final historic examples. The organization Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. Anybody hear of them? I've attended one of their lectures. They were founded in 1948 as Protestants and other Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. That is the attitude, right or wrong, that's the attitude behind the term separation of church and state. That Protestants felt we were so free that, I should say more clearly, that Christianity, Protestant Christianity, was so intertwined in our culture, including our educational system, as this guy was saying earlier, the Pope isn't letting Catholics go to public schools because they were Protestant for the most part. My elementary school, Johnson Elementary School in suburban Pittsburgh, we read from the Protestant Bible, one chapter, and we prayed the Protestant Lord's Prayer each morning. A public high school. Oh, it was in the last century, but not that long ago. Those are some of the clues toward understanding our history as a nation and what has shaped us to this time. The Constitution, according to Adams, and I think he's correct, assumes a moral and religious people. When he says religious, he's talking about Christianity. But we now live in a culture that can say, if Coach Kennedy is allowed to pray, just pray on his own. It's destroying democracy. That's how deep the ignorance is. That's how far we've strayed from our roots. Some have said, love your neighbor as yourself is the most, or one of the most political statements ever uttered. Because people are around us. We interact with people. Christians were good citizens in the day. They drove their chariots under 55 miles an hour. They paid taxes, but they would not say Kaiser Kyrios. No, they said Jesus Kyrios. Jesus is Lord. Good citizens, dual citizenship. We have that heritage, and I believe it's a Christian heritage in America. The alternative to silence is you allow those of opposing opinion to carry the day. No violence, but we need to respond with a godly response. I thank God, as Joe did, for some of those Supreme Court decisions this week. They were righteous decisions. And may we prayerfully be righteous in our own decisions and actions in the days and weeks to come. Amen.